Today we're going to continue our work thinking about World War I. We're going to move our focus to thinking about life in the trenches. Let's start by asking ourselves the key question: what was the First World War? A war is when countries fight each other. Over 100 years ago, in 1914, a war started. At the time, it was known as the Great War. This was because at the time it was the biggest war that the world had ever seen, and they did not know at the time that another war was going to follow. Lots of different countries fought at the same time, and it lasted for 4 years. Today we call this war the First World War. This is also because now we know that there was a Second World War which followed. So where did the fighting take place? Who were the main countries involved in the fighting of the First World War? Well, there was the United Kingdom and France. What do you notice about how close they are on the map? Japan were also involved. Look at how far they are on the map. This had a big impact on the world, didn't it? Russia were involved too. Look at the size of Russia. China became involved too. And let's not forget Germany, Austria, and Bulgaria. Fighting in the First World War was very difficult. In places where there was fighting, soldiers dug long, narrow holes in the ground. These holes were called trenches. They were usually several miles long. The soldiers lived in these trenches too. Can you imagine living in these trenches? They weren't very big, were they? And there wasn't just one man living in these trenches. There were quite a few. There wasn't enough space. The trenches were dirty, smelly and cold. There was often a lot of water on the ground, which soldiers would have to stand in all day and night. Trenches had very little protection from the weather, which meant that soldiers were often cold and wet from the wind and the rain. The poor conditions often meant that soldiers got very sick. Let's find out more about what the soldiers did in the trenches. Soldiers would need to cook and eat all of their meals within the trench. They also had to spend all of their free time in the trenches too. Some of them would use this time to play cards and other games with each other. This would help boost their morale. This means cheering each other up, just like you do in the classroom. When they were not fighting, soldiers were often asked to repair the trenches or help dig new ones too. Why do you think this might have been an important job? A lot of soldiers also liked to write letters home to their loved ones. Why do you think this might have been an important thing for soldiers to do? At night, soldiers were expected to stay awake and watch the enemy to see what they were doing. Fighting often happened very early in the morning. This meant that soldiers usually only got to sleep for a few hours in the afternoon. They didn't have proper beds, so they slept where they could. Soldiers also slept in their uniforms. Not only was there nowhere to change or keep their clothes, but soldiers had to be ready to wake up and start fighting in seconds. You never knew when the enemy might attack. What is the soldier wearing in this picture? Do you think you would be comfortable wearing that all day and sleeping in it too? I don't think I would. There were often a lot of creatures in the trenches too. Life in the trenches was made even more difficult because of the creatures who also made their homes in the holes. Trenches were full of rats. The rats would steal the soldiers' food and chew holes in their clothes. Some of the rats got so big they were the size of cats. Tiny little creatures called lice were everywhere in the trenches too, including on the soldiers. The soldiers felt very itchy and uncomfortable. When you think about it, this couldn't really be helped. It's not as if the soldiers had a bath or a shower on hand, did they? After 4 years, the war finally ended. All of the trenches were filled in. But if you go back to where the fighting took place, you can still see where some of the trenches used to be. Do you think you would have enjoyed living in the trenches?